The stars burned cold in the observation deck of the Varani diplomatic vessel as it approached Earth's orbital station. And Ambassador Trellix felt his three hearts hammering against his chest with a rhythm that spoke of pure terror mixed with desperate hope. Had argued against this mission for weeks, citing every regulation and historical precedent that warned against contacting the humans. But the Council of Voices had overruled him with the weight of extinction pressing down upon their collective decision. Scrath's swarm had consumed 14 star systems in the past galactic cycle, and the Communion's once proud defensive fleets now drifted as broken. Debris around lifeless worlds that had been stripped down to their core strelix watched through the viewport as Earth grew larger, a blue and green jewel wrapped in swirling white clouds. And he shuddered at the readings his science officer provided about the death world. Below the gravity alone would crush most Communion species within hours. The atmospheric pressure was dangerously high, and the native predators made their homeworlds look like peaceful gardens by comparison, Ambassador. The humans are responding to our hail, his communications officer announced. With a tremor in her voice that matched his own fear, the view screen flickered to life, revealing a human female in a dark blue uniform with silver insignia on her shoulders and an expression that seemed both curious and cautious. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of the United Defense Coalition," the human said imperfectly, translated Galactic Standard, though her accent carried strange harmonics that made Trellix's translator work harder than usual. "You've requested an emergency diplomatic meeting under First Contact Protocols." Trellix stood as straight as his flexible spine would allow and activated his own translator. Knowing that every word of this conversation would determine whether his people lived or died, Admiral Okonkwo. "I am Ambassador Trellix of the Varani people and representative of the Galactic Communion," he began, and his voice cracked despite decades of diplomatic training. "We come before humanity not as equals, seeking partnership, but as the desperate seeking salvation." The human's expression changed, her dark eyes narrowing with what his cultural database suggested was concern rather than anger. "Go on," she said. Simpla Trellix took a deep breath and laid out the nightmare that had driven the Communion to this moment of humiliation. He spoke of the swarm, of billions dead, of worlds reduced to barren rocks, of fleets that scattered like leaves before a storm of chittering hunger. He explained how the Communion had monitored Earth for 3 generations, watching as humanity clawed its way from a fractured collection of warring nations to a unified species that had finally achieved faster-than-light travel. He confessed that the Communion had deliberately avoided official contact because humanity's history of violence and their evolution on a Class 12 death world marked them as potentially dangerous. "We feared you," Trellix admitted, his translator catching the shame in his tone. "We thought you were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too shaped by a brutal world to join our peaceful civilization." Admiral Okonkwo listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing. And when Trellix finished his confession, she was silent for a long moment that stretched like centuries. "So you avoided us because you thought we were violent," she finally said, and Trellix detected what might have been amusement in her voice. "But now that you need warriors, you've come asking for our help?" "Yes," Trellix said, because there was no point in diplomatic deflection when extinction loomed. "The Communion can offer technology far beyond your current level. Resource rights to uninhabited systems, full membership with all privileges and protections." He paused, then added the words that burned like acid in his mouth. "We are prepared to offer whatever price you name." The human admiral's expression shifted again, and this time, Trellix's database identified it as something close to disappointment mixed with determination. "Ambassador Trellix?" "Let me make something very clear," Admiral Okonkwo said, and her voice carried a weight that made his translator struggle to convey the full meaning. "Humanity doesn't need to be bribed to help people who are facing genocide." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk before her, and her eyes locked onto Trellix's primary visual organs with an intensity that made him want to look away. "We'll help you fight the swarm," she continued. "Not because you're offering us technology or territory, but because it's the right thing to do." Trellix felt his legs weaken, and he had to grip the edge of his communication console to remain standing. "You cannot possibly understand what you are agreeing to," he said urgently, pulling up holographic displays that showed the true scale of the swarm's forces. "They number in the billions. They feel no fear. They cannot be reasoned with or deterred." The displays showed world after world consumed, fleets destroyed, and the projected path of the swarm's expansion that would reach the Communion. "Core worlds within 2 cycles, our greatest military minds have concluded that conventional warfare cannot stop them," Trellix explained, his voice rising with desperation. "You have been in space for less than a generation. Your technology is primitive by Communion standards. Your numbers are small, Admiral." Okonkwo studied the tactical displays with an expression that Trellix's database labeled as grim determination. And when she looked back at him, there was something in her eyes that sent a chill through his entire body despite the temperature controlled. "Environment Ambassador, you said you monitored Earth for 3 generations, the Admiral said quietly. "Did you watch our history? Did you see how humanity responds when faced with extinction-level threats?" Trellix nodded slowly, remembering the reports his predecessors had filed about human conflicts and their disturbing tendency to fight beyond all rational calculation. "Then you should know that we've faced long odds before," Admiral Okonkwo continued, and now she was smiling in a way that showed her teeth. "And we're still here." She touched a control on her desk, and Trellix's communication panel lit up with data streams that made his heart skip beats. "I'm forwarding your strategic data to our military command," the Admiral explained. "Within 12 hours, we'll have a strike force ready to deploy. And within 72 hours, our main battle fleet will be assembled." Trellix stared at the numbers flowing across his screen. Unable to fully process what he was seeing, the humans were mobilizing thousands of vessels, millions of soldiers. In supply chains that would drain significant portions of their planetary resources, "This will cost you enormously," he whispered. "Your economy will suffer. Your people will die in a war that is not yours." Admiral Okonkwo stood up from her desk, and even through the view screen, her presence seemed to fill the entire diplomatic vessel. "Ambassador Trellix, you're about to learn something important about humans," she said, and her voice carried absolute certainty. "When someone asks us for help against monsters that want to devour them and their children, we don't calculate the cost." She saluted, a gesture that Trellix's database identified as a sign of respect and commitment. "We answer the call," Admiral Okonkwo finished. "Now get your people ready, because Earth's Deathworlders are going to war." The transmission ended, and Trellix collapsed into his seat as his crew erupted in a mixture of relief and terror.
Ow.
Around him, they had come seeking warriors, and they had found something far more dangerous and far more hopeful than anything that Communion had imagined possible. They had found humans who fought not for profit or glory, but for the simple and terrifying principle that good people should stand. Against Evil, Trellix activated his emergency channel to the Council of Voices, and when the connection established, he delivered the message that would change galactic history. "The humans have agreed to help us," he reported, his voice shaking. "May the eternal light protect us all, because I think we've just unleashed something the galaxy has never seen before." Commander Marcus Chen stood in the training bay of the orbital station and watched his Marines run through combat drills that would have killed most sentient species in the galaxy. Within minutes, the gravity was set to Earth standard, which meant that the Virani observers in the protected gallery above were experiencing crushing pressure even through their support systems, and their translator kept picking up what sounded like frightened chittering. Chen allowed himself a small smile as Private Rodriguez executed a perfect zero-gravity breach maneuver, planting explosive charges on a mock bulkhead while taking simulated fire from 3 directions simultaneously. "Sir, the alien delegation is requesting that we lower the gravity settings," Sergeant Morrison reported, gesturing toward the observation gallery where Ambassador Trellix and his staff were watching. With what Chen's briefing materials suggested was a mixture of horror and fascination. "Tell them this is our standard training environment," Chen replied, making a note on his tactical pad about the enemy force compositions that Communion intelligence had provided. "If they can't handle watching it, they're welcome to return to their ship." Morrison grinned and relayed the message, while Chen turned his attention back to the training exercise. His team was good, among the best that Earth's United Defense Coalition could field. But he knew that good might not be enough against an enemy that numbered in the billions and felt no fear of the briefing materials about the Scrath, swarm made for nightmare reading, even by human standards. And Chen had seen some genuinely terrifying things during his 20 years of service. Swarm operated as a hive mind, controlled by a central intelligence that the Communion called the Empress. And every drone from the smallest scout to the largest bioship was part of that singular consciousness. They didn't retreat. They didn't negotiate. And they consumed everything organic they encountered to fuel their endless expansion. Chen's tactical pad chimed with an incoming transmission from Fleet, Admiral Okonkwo, and he stepped away from the training floor to take the call in relative privacy. Commander, how are our guests handling the culture shock? The Admiral asked, and Chen could hear the dry amusement in her voice about as well as expected. Ma'am, Chen replied, glancing back at the observation gallery where Trellix appeared to be having an animated discussion with his science officer. They keep requesting that we modify our training protocols to be less dangerous. Admiral Okonkwo made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh, and Chen suspected it was probably both. The Communion has been at peace for 6 generations, she explained, pulling up a data file that appeared on Chen's pad. Their military forces are primarily ceremonial guards and system patrol vessels, and they haven't fought a peer-level conflict in living memory. Chen scrolled through the tactical assessments and felt his stomach sink as he realized just how unprepared their new allies were for the kind of war they were about to fight. The Communion's defensive doctrine relied on energy shields and long-range particle weapons. With combat taking place at distances measured in thousands of kilometers, their ships were lightly armored by human standards. Their crews had minimal damage control training, and the concept of boarding actions or close-quarters combat was considered suicidally insane, ma'am. With all due respect, how do they expect to win a war if they can't even handle watching basic combat training? Chen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They don't expect to win, Commander, Admiral Okonkwo said quietly, and her expression turned grim. They expect us to win it for them. The weight of that statement settled on Chen's shoulders like a physical burden, and he looked back at his Marines with new understanding. These men and women, along with thousands more like them across the mobilizing fleet, were being asked to fight and die for people they had never met against. An enemy that terrified species far more advanced than humanity. The main battle fleet will be ready to deploy in 48 hours, the Admiral continued. Your strike team will be assigned to the flagship Indomitable, and you'll coordinate with Communion Special Forces for joint operations. Chen nodded, already running through the logistics in his mind and calculating what kind of training they could accomplish in 2 days with alien allies who had never experienced real combat. Understood, ma'am, he replied. We'll make it work, I know you will, Commander Admiral Okonkwo said, and there was confidence in her voice that Chen hoped was justified. One more thing. The Communion keeps apologizing that our ships don't have their advanced shielding technology or energy weapons. Chen raised an eyebrow, wondering where this was going. I told Ambassador Trellix that humans are pretty good at making do with what we have. The Admiral finished with a slight smile. Show them what kinetics and explosives can accomplish in the right hands. The transmission ended, and Chen turned back to the training floor where his team was setting up for the next exercise. He activated the intercom to the observation gallery and spoke in what he hoped was a reassuring tone. Ambassador Trellix, would you and your staff like to join us on the training floor for a closer look at human combat doctrine? There was a long pause before Trellix's translated voice came through the speakers, sounding uncertain and more than a little frightened. Commander Chen, our physiology cannot tolerate your gravity settings for extended periods, the ambassador explained. Perhaps we could observe from our current location. Chen made a decision that he suspected would either help their allies understand what they were getting into or completely terrify them. Beyond reason, Sergeant Morrison. Set up the boarding scenario, he called out. Full combat simulation with live ammunition. Morrison's grin widened as she began issuing orders, and the training bay transformed into a mock-up of a swarm bioship based on Communion intelligence data. Marines loaded their weapons with training rounds that were still lethal enough to kill if you weren't wearing proper armor, and Chen watched as they moved into position with the fluid grace of predators, preparing to strike. Ambassador, "You're about to see how humans fight when conventional tactics fail," Chen said into the intercom. "We call this close quarters battle, and it's what happens when you can't rely on shields or long-range weapons." What followed over the next 30 minutes was a demonstration of controlled chaos that made the Varani observers emit distress, signals their translators couldn't properly convey. The Marines breached the mock bioship with explosive charges, stormed through narrow corridors while taking fire from automated defense systems, and executed room-clearing techniques that involved split-second timing and absolute trust in their teammates' private. Rodriguez took a training round to the shoulder that would have incapacitated most species, but she rolled with the impact, returned fire, and kept advancing until the objective was secured. Sergeant Morrison coordinated the team through hand signals and short verbal commands, adapting to changing conditions with a speed that suggested years of experience fighting in unpredictable environments. The exercise ended with all objectives completed and only minor injuries to the assault team. Chen looked up at the observation gallery and saw that Trellix had gone completely still in a way that his briefing materials suggested indicated profound shock. The intercom crackled to life, and the ambassador's voice was barely above a whisper. "Commander Chen, your soldiers continued fighting after being wounded," Trellix said, and there was something like disbelief in his translated words. "They advanced into positions where death was almost certain. They used explosives in confined spaces that could have killed them as easily as the enemy." Chen considered his response carefully, knowing that this moment might determine how well humans and communion forces could work together in the battles to come. "Ambassador, humans come from a world that has been trying to kill us since before we developed language," he explained. "We learned to fight through pain, to advance when retreat seemed logical, to use whatever tools we have to overcome obstacles that should be impossible." He gestured to his team, who were already preparing for the next training scenario despite their exhaustion and minor injuries. "We don't fight because we're fearless," Chen continued. "We fight because we're terrified, and we do it anyway. Because that's what it takes to protect the things we care about." Trellix was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of awe and something that might have been pity. "Your world made you into weapons," the ambassador said softly. Chen shook his head, rejecting that characterization, even as he understood why the alien might see it that way. "Our world made us survivors," he corrected. "And now we're going to teach your people how to survive too?" He activated his tactical pad and pulled up the joint training schedule that would begin in 6 hours. Knowing that it would push both humans and aliens to their absolute limits, "Get your special forces team ready, Ambassador," Chen said with determination. "Because in 2 days, we jump into hell together. And I need to know that you'll have our backs when the swarm comes at us with everything they have." The training bay fell silent, except for the sound of weapons being reloaded and equipment being checked. And Chen allowed himself one moment of doubt before pushing it aside. Earth's Deathworlders were going to war, and they would show the galaxy what humanity meant by the word valor. The combined fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler's reach system, and every sensor aboard the Indomitable immediately screamed warnings about the nightmare waiting for them. Fleet Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship and studied the tactical display that showed hundreds of swarm bioships clustered around the mining colonies like flies on a corpse beside her. Ambassador Trellix made a sound that his translator rendered as profound grief mixed with rage. "Those colonies house 3 million Kiksari miners and their families," the ambassador said quietly, his 3-fingered hands gripping the railing so hard that his knuckles turned pale blue. "They sent a distress call 14 hours ago." Okonkwo didn't need to ask if there were survivors, because the scans showed colony domes breached and atmospheres venting into space, while swarm harvester ships methodically stripped the settlements down to their foundations. "All ships, battle stations," she ordered, her voice carrying across the fleet command channel. "Communion vessels. Standard defensive formation Delta 7. The Communion warships began moving into position with practiced precision, their elegant forms taking up positions that would maximize their energy weapon coverage, while keeping their vulnerable engineering sections protect. Okonkwo watched them deploy and felt a mixture of respect for their tactical discipline and frustration. At their inherent limitations, Admiral, the Communion Fleet Commander is requesting confirmation of our battle plan, her communications officer reported. He's recommending we maintain maximum range and wear down the swarm forces with particle beam attrition. Okonkwo pulled up the projected battle timeline for that approach and saw that it would take 16 hours of continuous fighting with casualty estimates that climbed steadily. As the swarm adapted to their tactics negative, she said, making a decision that she knew would terrify their allies, all human vessels. Offensive Formation Omega-3. Her tactical officer looked up from his station with surprise that quickly shifted to understanding, and he began transmitting the new orders with enthusiasm, ma'am. The Communion Commander is objecting strongly, the communications officer said, his voice rising slightly. He says that closing to knife-fighting range with the swarm is tactically insane and will result in unacceptable casualties. Okonkwo activated her command channel and spoke directly to the Communion Fleet Commander, a Thurman named Kelvar, who had survived 2 previous encounters with the swarm by retreating before his ships were destroyed. Commander Kelvar. With respect to your experience, humanity didn't travel across the galaxy to play it safe, she said firmly. We came here to win. And that means taking the fight directly to the enemy. There was a moment of silence before Kelvar responded. And when he did, his translated voice carried resignation mixed with something that might have been admiration. Admiral Okonkwo. May your ancestors guide your path, he said formally. The Communion Fleet will provide covering fire and support. But we cannot follow you into close engagement, understood, Commander, Okonkwo replied. Hold the perimeter and don't let anything escape to warn the main swarm fleet. She cut the channel and turned to her crew. Seeing faces that ranged from eager to terrified, but all absolutely committed to the mission ahead, people, this is what we trained for, she said, letting her voice carry the confidence she felt even in the face of overwhelming odds. The swarm thinks they're apex predators, but they've never met Deathworlders before. She paused. Making eye contact with key personnel around the bridge today, we show them what humans do to monsters. Okonkwo finished. All ships. Advance. The human fleet surged forward in a formation that would have seemed suicidal to any conventional military force. And within seconds, the swarm bioships detected their approach and began swarming to intercept the first exchange of fire lit up the tactical display like a deadly constellation, with communion particle beams lancing out from maximum range, while the swarm responded with biological projectiles that moved with disturbing intelligence. Human ships ignored the long-range duel and kept accelerating, their armored hulls absorbing punishment that would have crippled communion vessels while their kinetic weapons remained. Silent, entering optimal firing range in 30 seconds, the tactical officer reported, his hands dancing over his controls as he coordinated targeting. Solutions across the fleet. Okonkwo watched the range counter tick down and felt time slow the way it always did before combat. Every detail becoming crystal clear in her mind. All weapons free, she ordered. Show them what kinetic kill vehicles can do. The Indomitable shuddered as its railguns opened fire, launching projectiles at velocities that turned simple metal slugs into devastating weapons that punched through bioship hulls like Papercross, the human fleet. Similar weapon systems unleashed hell in the form of mass moving at relativistic speeds, and the swarm formation shattered as dozens of their ships exploded or tumbled away. Trailing organic debris, the swarm adapted within seconds, their vessels scattering and attempting to surround the human formation. But Okonkwo had anticipated that response. All ships. Execute attack pattern Alpha, she commanded. Break formation and engage at will. What followed was chaos by communion standards and coordinated mayhem by human reckoning, with each vessel becoming a semi-independent unit that hunted through the swarm. Fleet with aggressive precision, the Indomitable's crew fought their ship with practiced efficiency, the helmsman throwing the massive vessel through maneuvers that seemed impossible for something so large, while the weapons teams kept up a continuous barrage. Multiple bioships attempting to board us, the tactical officer reported. They're latching onto the hull in sections 7 through 12. Okonkwo smiled grimly and activated the ship-wide intercom. Commander Chen. You're up, she said. We've got bugs on the hull that need exterminating in the lower decks. Marcus Chen and his Marine strike team had been waiting for exactly this moment, and they moved toward the hull breaches with weapons ready and determination burning in their eyes. Swarm boarding forms that cut through the Indomitable's outer hull were nightmares made flesh, all katanas armor and razor-sharp, limbs driven by the relentless intelligence of the Hive Minchin's first sight of them through his helmet. Camera made him reassess every assumption he'd made about the enemy, because these things moved with coordinated precision that suggested they were extensions of a single, vast consciousness. Light them up, he ordered. And his team opened fire with a mixture of armor-piercing rounds and incendiary ammunition that turned the corridor into a killing field. The swarm creatures kept coming, even as their bodies were torn apart, climbing over their dead to reach the Marines with single-minded purpose. Private Rodriguez went down under a mass of chittering bodies, and Chen's heart stopped until he saw her trigger the claymore. Mine she'd been carrying. The explosion cleared the corridor, and Rodriguez rolled to her feet, covered in alien blood but still fighting. Her armor scarred but intact. Boarding teams eliminated in Sections 7 and 9, Chen reported, coordinating with other squad leaders across the ship. Section 11 is holding but taking heavy pressure. He led his team towards Section 11 at a dead run, knowing that every second counted when your ship was being invaded by creatures that felt no fear or pain. Arrived to find Sergeant Morrison's squammed down by a massive swarm warrior that had carved through 3 bulkheads to reach the ship's critical systems. Chen didn't hesitate, arming a plasma charge and throwing it with the precision of long practice directly into the creature's center mass. The explosion should have killed everything in a 10-meter radius, but Chen had positioned his team behind blast cover, while Morrison's squad had done the same. When the smoke cleared, the swarm warrior was finally dead, and Chen allowed himself one moment of relief before moving on to the next crisis. Back on the bridge, Okonkwo watched the tactical display update as human ships systematically destroyed or disabled the swarm fleet despite taking damage that would have ended most battles. The Communion forces held the perimeter and provided covering fire, their crews watching in stunned disbelief as human vessels continued fighting. Even after sustaining catastrophic damage, one destroyer lost its main engines, but kept firing. Another took a direct hit that vented 3 decks to space, but the crew sealed the compartments and maintained at combat effectiveness. Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from Commander Kelvar, the communications officer said, and there was something like awe in his voice. Okonkwo activated the channel and heard the Thurman commander speaking in tones that suggested profound shock. Admiral Okonkwo, your ship has been boarded by swarm warriors. You've taken damage to multiple critical systems, and your casualties must be significant, Kelvar said slowly. Why are you not withdrawing for repairs? Okonkwo looked at the tactical display that showed the swarm fleet down to less than 30% of its original strength and breaking apart under human assault commander. We withdraw when the enemy is destroyed, not before, she replied simply. That's how humans fight. She cut the channel and focused on the final phase of the battle, coordinating the fleet to eliminate the remaining swarm vessels before they could escape or call for reinforcements. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working in the Indomitable's medical bay for 42 hours straight, and her hands shook with exhaustion as she sutured the wound on the Kiksari pilot's thorax. The pilot's name was Zixtel, and he had been shot down during the battle for the Meridian colonies when his fighter took direct hits from 3 swarm interceptors. His species had evolved in low gravity, which meant that the standard Earth gravity of the medical bay was slowly crushing him, even as Mitchell worked to save his life. Corman Davies, I need you to rig a localized gravity field around this bed, Mitchell ordered, not looking up from her work as she carefully aligned the edges of chitin that served as the Kiksari's exoskeleton. Davies moved with practiced efficiency despite his own exhaustion, assembling a portable field generator from salvaged parts and Communion technology that probably violated a dozen safety regulations. Done. Doc, he said, activating the device that reduced the gravity around Zixel's bed to 1/3 Earth standard. The pilot's breathing immediately eased, his translator emitting sounds of relief that needed no interpretation. Mitchell allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before moving on to the next patient, a human Marine who had lost his left arm below the elbow during a boarding action and was cracking jokes with the nurse while waiting for surgery. "Doc, you gotta help my buddy here first," the Marine said, gesturing toward Zixtel with his remaining hand. "He's in worse shape than me, Marine." "You're bleeding out and going into shock," Mitchell replied firmly. "I can stabilize you both. So shut up and let me work." She had learned over the past 3 weeks of continuous combat that human and alien physiology were different in countless ways. But the basics of trauma medicine remained universal: stop the bleeding, maintain the airway, treat for shock, and do everything possible to keep your patients alive long enough to get them proper care. The medical bay doors opened and Sergeant Morrison limped in, supporting a Varani soldier whose lower appendages had been badly burned by swarm acid. Weapons Mitchell's heart sank as she realized she had 17 patients already in only 3 functional beds. But she pushed the despair aside and focused on triage. Corman Davies, "Get the Varani on bed 4 and start fluid replacement," she ordered. "Morrison, sit down before you fall down and let me look at that leg." Morrison shook her head stubbornly, her face pale but determined. "Doc, there are wounded still coming in from the forward compartments," she said through gritted teeth. "I can walk, so I'm helping carry the ones who can't." Mitchell wanted to argue, but she recognized the look in Morrison's eyes. The same expression she saw in the mirror every time she thought about stopping to rest. They were all running on willpower and stimulants now, pushing their bodies past reasonable limits because people were depending on them. "Fine, but take these," Mitchell said, handing Morrison a pack of combat stimulants and pain suppressors. "And if you collapse, I'm having you dragged back here in restraints." Morrison grinned and limped back out into the corridor. And Mitchell returned her attention to the Marine with the missing arm 3 hours later. She finally had a moment to breathe when the last critical patient was stabilized, and she found herself standing in the corridor outside the medical bay, drinking coffee that tasted like recycled engine oil. Ambassador Trellix approached slowly, his movements careful in the Earth's gravity environment despite his support exoskeleton. "Dr. Mitchell, I have been observing your work," the ambassador said quietly, his translator catching the emotion in his voice. "You have been treating communion wounded with the same care and urgency as your own people." Mitchell shrugged. "Too tired for diplomatic niceties? They're all my patients, Ambassador," she replied simply. "I don't care what planet they're from, as long as I can keep them alive." Trellix was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been wonder. "The Communion Medical Corps follow strict protocols about resource allocation during combat," he explained. "Priority is given to those most likely to survive and most strategically valuable. And difficult cases are often deemed not worth the effort." Mitchell felt anger surged through her exhaustion. Hot and bright, that pilot in there, Zixtel. His injuries would have killed him in an hour if we hadn't improvised solutions using equipment that wasn't designed for his species. She said harshly, "Are you telling me your people would have just let him die?" "Yes," Trellix admitted, and he seemed to shrink in on himself with shame because by our calculations, the resources spent saving him could have stabilized 3 less critical patients. Mitchell stared at the ambassador and suddenly understood something fundamental about the gulf between human and communion thinking. "Ambassador, we don't do calculus with people's lives," she said firmly. "Every patient gets our best effort." Period. She turned to go back into the medical bay, but Trellix's next words stopped her. "Dr. Mitchell, your approach is not efficient or logical, and it will cost you resources and personnel that could be better allocated elsewhere," the ambassador said softly. "But it is perhaps the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed in the ship's galley." Private Rodriguez sat with a mixed group of human Marines and communion soldiers, sharing ration packs and stories despite the language barriers. The Thurman engineer, named Calcith, watched in fascination as Rodriguez ate her way through a meal pack that contained enough calories to feed 3 Thurman for a day. "How do you consume so much energy?" Calcith asked through his translator, his curiosity overcoming his usual reserve. Rodriguez grinned and held up a protein bar that the Thurman scanner identified as containing compounds that would be toxic to most communion species. "Deathworld metabolism, my friend," she explained cheerfully. My body burns through fuel like a fusion reactor, because Earth tried to kill my ancestors every single day. She broke the protein bar in half and offered part to the Kiksari pilot at the next table, who accepted it hesitantly. Plus, we're about to go into another battle. And I learned a long time ago to eat whenever you get the chance, Rodriguez continued. Her tone becoming more serious, the communion soldiers shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the upcoming engagement. And Rodriguez noticed their fear with the instincts of someone who had been scared plenty of times herself. Hey, it's okay to be afraid, she said gently. I'm terrified every time we drop into a combat zone. The Varani soldier named Pelthar made a sound of disbelief through his translator. But you fight with such fearlessness, he protested. I watched you during the boarding action last week. And you advanced directly into enemy fire without hesitation? Rodriguez laughed. But there was no humor in it that wasn't fearlessness. That was training and trust, she explained. I knew my squad mates had my back. And I knew that if I stopped moving, I'd definitely die. So I kept going forward. She paused. Gathering her thoughts before continuing, fear is what keeps you alive if you listen to it properly, Rodriguez said seriously. It sharpens your reflexes, makes you careful, reminds you that what you're doing matters because the stakes are real. Calcith leaned forward, his engineering mind trying to understand the contradiction. But how do you function when you are afraid? He asked. The communion forces are trained to avoid situations that trigger fear responses. Rodriguez looked around the table at the mixed group of human and alien soldiers, and she saw the question reflected in all their eyes. You function because you have something worth being afraid for. She said quietly, I'm scared of dying, sure, but I'm more scared of letting down the people who depend on me. She gestured toward the communion soldiers with her remaining piece of protein bar. You guys asked for our help. And that means we're in this together now, Rodriguez continued. So when the swarm comes at us, I'll be scared. But I'll fight anyway because that's what you do for friends. The word friends seemed to ripple through the translators in multiple languages. And Pelthar made a sound that Rodriguez's implant identified as profound emotion. We are friends? The Varani asked uncertainly. We have only known each other for a few weeks. And our species have so little in common? Rodriguez grinned and raised her water bottle in a toast pal. I've bled next to you, shared my food with you, and watched you hold the line when things got bad, she said firmly. That makes you a friend in my book. The communion soldiers hesitantly raised their own drinking containers, and the humans laughed and cheered, turning the moment into an impromptu celebration on the bridge. Fleet Admiral Okonkwo reviewed intelligence. Reports that confirmed her worst fears about the swarm's strategic intentions. They're massing for an assault on the Varani homeworlds, she said too. Commander Chen and Ambassador Trellix, pulling up tactical projections that showed millions of bioships converging on a single star. System Trellix's entire body trembled as he stared at the display, showing his species' sanctuary world of Trelvor surrounded by red threat indicators. 7 billion Varani live on that world, he whispered. Civilians, families, children who have never known war. Okonkwo studied the force ratios and saw that the combined human and communion fleet was outnumbered, roughly 50-1, with no reinforcements available in time to make a difference. The space above Trelvor burned with the fury of 1,000 suns as the combined fleet dropped out of faster than light travel directly into the maw of the swarms assembled. Might Fleet Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and watched the tactical display fill with red threat indicators until the entire screen looked like it was bleeding swarm. Forces number approximately 3 million bioships. Her tactical officer reported in a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will. They've formed a blockade pattern around Trelvor and are beginning atmospheric bombardment below them on the sanctuary world. 7 billion Varani huddled in underground shelters and watched the skies fill with the nightmare shapes of descending swarm. Harvester vessel Okonkwo activated her command channel and spoke to the entire fleet with absolute calm. All ships execute attack plan Omega Final, she ordered communion forces. Defensive screen Delta Maximum around Trelvor. The communion warships moved into position with desperate precision. their commanders knowing that this was the last stand for their entire civilization. Commander Kelvar's voice came through on the channel. Carrying resignation mixed with fierce determination, Admiral Okonkwo. "It has been an honor to fight alongside humanity," he said formally. "May we meet again in whatever lies beyond, Commander." "Save the eulogies for after we win," Okonkwo replied sharply. All human vessels advanced to contact the human fleet surged forward in a formation that had been designed over 4 sleepless days by the best tactical minds humanity and the Communion could assemble working together. It was insane, suicidal, and completely impossible by every conventional measure of warfare. It was also their only chance, ma'am. "The swarm is responding to our advance," the sensor officer called out. "They're detaching approximately 500,000 bioships to intercept." Okonkwo smiled grimly and activated her personal channel to Commander Marcus Chen, who was suited up in the ship's assault bay with his hand-picked strike team commander. "You're clear to launch," she said quietly. "Give them hell, understood, ma'am," Chen replied, and she could hear the controlled fear in his voice mixing with absolute determination. Strike team away, the assault shuttles launched from the Indomitable and a dozen other human ships, accelerating toward the heart of the swarm formation, while the main fleet drew the enemy's attention with aggressive maneuvers. Chun's shuttle shook as it dodged through clouds of bioprojectiles and energy weapons, the pilot executing maneuvers that would have been impossible without the augmented reflexes humanity had developed for combat in 3-dimensional space. Targeting data shows the Empress is in the central command vessel, Chen told his team over the squad channel. "Intelligence says if we take her out, the hive mind collapses and the swarm becomes disorganized." Private Rodriguez checked her weapons for the 3rd time and tried not to think about the fact that they were flying directly toward a creature that controlled millions of drones with the power of its vast alien consciousness, sir. "The Communion Special Forces are confirming they're ready," Sergeant Morrison reported from her position coordinating with their alien allies. Chun looked around his shuttle at the mixed team of humans and Communion soldiers who had trained together over the past 4 days, learning each other's strengths and building trust through shared hardship. Holthar the Varani met his eyes and made a gesture that Chen's cultural implant translated as determination mixed with acceptance of possible death. "Whatever happens, Commander Chen, I am grateful to have fought beside Deathworlders," Pelther said through his translator Pel. "We're all Deathworlders now," Chen replied with a fierce grin. "And we're all getting home alive." The shuttle's proximity alarm screamed as they approached the Empress's bioship, a massive organic structure that dwarfed anything else in the swarm fleet. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted, and the shuttle slammed into the bioship's hull with explosive force that crumpled the front section and killed the pilot. Instantly, Chen's world became a chaos of smoke and alarms. As the team fought their way out of the wreckage and into the hostile environment of the swarm command vessel, the interior was a nightmare of organic corridors that pulsed with alien life, and the swarm defenders that came at them moved with coordinated precision that spoke of the Empress's direct control. "Contact front," Morrison screamed, opening fire with her heavy plasma rifle into a mass of warrior forms that boiled out of side passages. The team moved forward with practiced efficiency, humans and aliens covering each other's weaknesses and advancing through sheer, bloody-minded determination. Rodriguez went down with a swarm claw through her shoulder, and Calcith, the Thurman engineer, dragged her back while laying down, covering fire with one of the human weapons he'd learned to use. "Keep moving," Chen ordered, consulting his tactical display that showed their objective was still 300 meters deeper into the ship. "We don't stop until the Empress is dead above them in the orbital battle." The human fleet was being torn apart piece by piece. Despite fighting with every trick and tactic they possessed, the Indomitable had lost main power to half its systems. The destroyer Valiant was venting atmosphere from 17 hull breaches, and the casualty reports were climbing into numbers that made Okonkwo's heart bleed. "Admiral, Communion forces are reporting that the swarm is breaking through the defensive screen," her tactical officer said urgently. "Harvester ships are entering Trelvor's atmosphere." Okonkwo watched helplessly as the tactical display showed enemy vessels descending toward population centers. Knowing that every second of delay meant thousands more civilian deaths, all ships. "Concentrate fire on the harvesters," she ordered. "Don't let them reach the cities." The human fleet turned their weapons toward the descending swarm ships with desperate intensity, and the communion vessels followed their lead despite catastrophic damage. Commander Kelvar. Ship took a direct hit that should have destroyed it completely. But somehow the Thurman commander kept his vessel fighting, even as fires raged through half the decks for Trelvar. Kelvar's voice came through the channel, distorted by damage to his communications system, for the communion. "For our human brothers and sisters who fight beside us," his ship rammed a swarm harvester that was seconds away from reaching a major city. And the combined explosion lit up Trelvar's sky like a second sun inside the Empress's vessel. Chen's team had been reduced to half its original strength through brutal attrition. But they had finally reached the central chamber. The Empress herself was beyond anything Chen had imagined. A creature of terrifying beauty, an alien intelligence that radiated power through the very air she spoke, and though the words were in no language Chen recognized, his implant struggled to translate the intent. "You are remarkable specimens." The Empress's thoughts invaded his mind like poison. So much potential wasted on defending lesser species. Chen raised his plasma rifle despite the psychic pressure that made his head feel like it was splitting apart. "We defend our friends," he said through gritted teeth. "That's what makes us better than you." The Empress's response was a wave of warrior forms that came at the team from every direction. And Chen knew with absolute certainty that they were all about to die. "Morrison, Rodriguez, Pelther, everyone get behind me," he ordered, pulling out the nuclear demolition charge that he'd been carrying since they launched. "I'm buying you time to escape." Morrison grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "Sir, if you arm that thing in here, you'll be at ground zero," she protested. Shun smiled at her with genuine affection and pushed her toward the exit corridor. "That's the plan." "Sergeant," he said calmly, "someone has to make sure this monster stays dead." Pelthar made a sound of protest, his translator catching the anguish in his voice. "Commander Chen, you said we would all get home alive," the Varani said. "I lied," Chen replied. "Now get out of here." "That's an order." The team retreated under covering fire from Chen's position. And when the last of them disappeared around the corner, he activated the nuclear charge with a timer set for 30 seconds. Empress sensed what he had done, and her fury was like a physical blow. "Foolish human. You cannot stop the swarm with one sacrifice." Her thoughts hammered into his consciousness. Sean laughed despite the pain. Positioning himself between the charge and the corridor where the Empress's warriors were trying to follow his team, "Maybe not. But I can stop you." And that's enough. He opened his command channel one last time and transmitted to Admiral Okonkwo. "Ma'am, this is Commander Chen," he said, his voice steady, despite knowing these were his last words. "Charges are set. Tell Earth we held the line. And tell the Communion they're worth it." The explosion that followed tore apart the Empress's bioship and killed the vast intelligence that had controlled the entire swarm above Trelvar. Every swarm vessel suddenly lost coordination as the hive mind collapsed, and millions of bioships became nothing more than mindless drones that scattered in confusion. "Admiral, the swarm forces are breaking formation," the tactical officer shouted with disbelief. "They're retreating." "No, they're just drifting without coordination."